Welcome to the Institute for Life Course and Aging.
It hasn't started yet.
Okay. Is it on? Welcome to the Institute for Life Course and Aging. We're very pleased to have with us today Dr. Ahmed Bayoumi. I hope I say your name. And he is the the program director, rather, of the Clinical Epidemiology and Healthcare Research Program at HPME, which is the Health Policy Management Evaluation Department here at the University of Toronto in the Faculty of Medicine. And we're very pleased to have him with us today. He did his medical doctorate here at U of T and went off to Stanford to do a postdoc, and is back here at U of T as an assistant professor, both in the Department of Medicine and in the Department of Health Policy Evaluation and Management. And he's also a research scientist, both at the Keenan Research Center at St. Michael's, I guess it is, at Inner City Health. And so we're very pleased to have him with us today to talk about HIV screening. And Dr. Bayoumi, I will let you go for it.
Do we know how many people are?
Right now, there's one person.
So I'm going to talk about an economic analysis of routine screening for HIV in people over the age of 55. And it struck me that I was really going to be talking about a couple of things that you probably don't know or probably haven't heard very much about in these seminars. One is economic analysis and the other is HIV. So I'm going to try and do a little bit, very brief background on both of those in the context of the talk. But mostly what I want to talk about is thinking about HIV in people over the age of 55. So the other thing actually that when we were doing this work, we really struggled with a term for people over the age of 55 because elderly certainly isn't appropriate, and older people seemed not very appropriate either. So we sort of ended up using the term older people, but for this talk, older means 55 and older. And if anybody is over 55 who's listening to this talk, there is that is just there's no judgment in that. It's just a number. So I do want to acknowledge my main collaborators in this work: Julian Sanders from Duke University and Doug Owens from Stanford, and I have no personal conflicts. So HIV is a virus. HIV is transmitted between people. It is transmitted sexually. It is transmitted through blood. Their blood is now screened, so there's very little, virtually no transfusion through blood products now, but still can be transmitted, for example, by injection drug users who share syringes or needles, and thus inadvertently share blood as well. It can be transmitted vertically, meaning from a mother to her child, either in utero or at the time of delivery, and it can be transmitted through breast milk. One of the most significant features of HIV is that it has a very long incubation period. The incubation period is on the order of years. And so in other words, from the time somebody becomes infected until the time that they first manifest symptoms is often several years. Sometimes it's shorter, but the usual is many years, which is why HIV transmission is such a big problem. So clearly if people became ill early on, they might take steps to prevent transmission. But many people don't know that they're HIV positive. I'll come back to that in a minute. And because they don't know, and because the period between infection and symptoms is so long, there's a very big window, a long opportunity in which people might transmit. HIV acts by slowly weakening the immune system. And the main target is one of the cells called the CD4 cell. That's the only immunology in the talk. But the CD4 cell essentially is one of the cells of the immune system that serves to strengthen the immune system. As HIV slowly decreases the number of CD4 cells over the course of many years, people's immune systems become weaker and weaker, and they become more and more susceptible to infections. So the number of CD4 cells is a measure of immune dysfunction. We have very effective therapy now for HIV. There's still no cure. The goals of therapy are to suppress the amount of virus in the body. We measure the amount of virus that's in plasma, in blood. We can't measure the amount of virus that's in some other areas like lymph nodes and in the brain. But the goal is to get the viral load down as low as possible. And when we do that, the CD4 counts can actually come back up. So there's some reconstitution of the immune system. So we can't cure HIV. We can treat it. People will live for a long time. Nobody really knows how long, but the estimates are anywhere upwards of 20, 25, 30, maybe even 40 years if they are treated. But preventing HIV is still crucially important. And to prevent it, we have to know who's HIV positive so that we can give those people education. And there's good evidence that simply identifying somebody as HIV positive in and of itself, doing nothing else but just testing and telling people they're HIV positive, changes people's behaviors so that they will take steps to decrease transmission on average. So knowing who's HIV positive would be a useful thing to do. There are two general approaches. One is targeted screening, and this has been traditionally what's been done. In other words, rather than testing everybody for HIV, we identify those people who are at risk for HIV, and we offer them testing. So people have to take a sexual history, identify the number of partners, the type of sex act, and depending on that, offer HIV testing. The alternative is routine or universal screening. In other words, we incorporate HIV into standard of care. So much the same way that your healthcare provider might measure your blood pressure or measure your cholesterol, perhaps they should also be offering you an HIV test. And I say you because this is routine, so this would apply to everybody. So I want to be clear here, we're not talking about mandatory screening here. We're talking about routine voluntary screening, so that everybody gets offered the test. It doesn't mean everybody would necessarily accept the test. But what's different from here and here is that here healthcare providers offer based on what they perceive as risk factors. Here it's offered to everyone. So in the U.S., the Centers for Disease Control looked at their past recommendations, which were to do targeted screening. And they did this a couple of years ago. And the reason they did this was for several reasons. First of all, there was a lot of evidence that people are diagnosed late. And by that I mean, remember we talked about the CD4 count being a measure of immune function. CD4 count declines over time. So many people are diagnosed when their CD4 count is already very low. And that offers less opportunity to build the immune system back up. We have effective treatment. So in the past, when there wasn't very good treatment, people said, well, what's the benefit of diagnosing early anyway? But now, in fact, there is. The earlier we treat, probably the better it is for the individual in terms of building up their immune system. And there's a public health benefit because the lower the viral load in blood, the lower the viral load in sexual fluids, and the less HIV is transmitted. So treating people is good for the individual, and it's also good more generally in terms of as public health. As I already said, increasing awareness reduces high-risk sexual activity, so informing people that they're positive. So these were sort of the recommendations. And there were several demonstration projects. This is all done in the US. I'll talk a little bit later about what's being done in Canada, and the answer, I'll give you a preview, is not very much. So there were several demonstration projects that showed that offering routine screening could be very effective. So in other words, it could be done. with a high rate of success in terms of actually offering it, and the uptake was actually also quite high in these demonstration projects. And furthermore, many of the people who were identified as being HIV positive were people who never thought that they were at risk for HIV. The what me sort of answer. And anybody who takes care of people living with HIV knows that there are many people like this around who never thought that they would be at risk. And going to the other end of the life course, right, in terms of preventing transmission from mothers to babies, we have very effective methods for doing that now. So the number of babies, the number of women who get pregnant who are HIV positive is still fairly high. The number of babies born who are HIV positive is vanishingly low because we have very good methods of preventing that. So this was really a strong impetus to sort of relook at screening altogether. And one of the reasons this is so is because all pregnant women now, including in Ontario, are offered routine HIV testing during pregnancy. So it's now, there's a form that the healthcare provider fills out for a pregnant woman, and one checkbox on that is offered HIV testing. So here's a little bit more what I was talking about before. These are U.S. data. Of all the people living with HIV in the U.S., it's estimated about 75% know, and about 25% don't know that they're HIV positive. And there isn't very good data for Canada, but it's probably about the same. What little data we have suggests that it's about the same. Okay. So most people know, but a quarter of people don't. Furthermore, that quarter makes up more than half the new infections. So if we're going to prevent new infections, we certainly have to still work with this group, the people who know they're HIV positive, but we have to particularly pay some attention to identify those 25% of people who don't know that they're HIV positive. So I haven't talked about the elderly yet, or people over age 55. And before I do that, let me tell you what happened up until now. So that was sort of the background. As I said, the CDC revisited their guidelines. And our group, as well as another group, did some economic analysis saying, would it make sense? So you can imagine that if we were going to do routine screening, it might make sense in some populations where the prevalence of HIV is high, but it might not make sense economically where HIV is very low. So if we're just going to screen many, many people and find very few cases, that might not be a very efficient use of money. Well, so we looked at this, and we said, I'll come back to what this means, but using this threshold for what makes sense economically, if the prevalence of undiagnosed HIV is 1 in 2,000 or higher, it makes sense economically. In other words, if you took 2,000 people and screened them, and you found one person or more, then it would make sense. And our best guesses are for downtown Toronto, we're probably above that. So if you took 2,000 people in downtown Toronto who and just routinely tested them for HIV, you would probably find at least one person who was positive. And there's similar research from other groups. There's data that says that many people at risk are not being tested. So it's not just the who me, I've only had 2 sex partners or 3 sex partners, and I'm shocked that I'll talk about me personally. You know, the person who says this and says, how could this happen to me? It's not just those people. It's also people who actually do have risk factors, but those risks, they don't tell people about their risk factors. Healthcare providers don't ask about their risk factors, and so they were never identified as being at risk. Those people are also important. And the CDC revised their guidelines. So just a little bit of terminology. So diagnostic testing, this is CDC's terminology, means performing an HIV test based on clinical signs or symptoms. Screening is performing an HIV test for all persons in a defined population. So we're really here talking about screening, not diagnostic testing. We're not talking about people who present with signs or symptoms, we're talking about asymptomatic people. talking about screening, and then targeted testing is performing HIV tests on subpopulations based on behavioral, clinical, or demographic characteristics. So gay men, injection drug users, that sort of thing, people with multiple sex partners. Right? And then the opposite, or the other approach is universal testing. And then opt-out screening is also important. We'll come back to this. In general, one of the features of HIV testing has been that there's been a long consent process to do that testing. So the CDC was also very interested in making that process less onerous. And so one thing they did was say that offer the option of opt-out testing. So this is sort of like when the cable company tells you they're going to start billing you for more channels, unless you say that you don't want to, right? So it's offered to you unless you specifically opt out. And so this perhaps was the most controversial aspect of this. But they also looked at opt-out testing. So performing a test after notifying the patient that the test will be done, consent is inferred unless the patient declines. So here were their recommendations. Routine, so, and this is from the CDC's own slide set, that's why it looks a bit different. So routine, so part of regular care, voluntary, so not mandatory, voluntary HIV screening for all persons between the ages of 13 and 64 in healthcare settings not based on risk. Okay, so these are official recommendations of the Public Health Agency of the United States government. Repeat HIV screening should be done for persons who are known to be at risk at least annually. They endorsed opt-out HIV screening with the opportunity to ask questions and the option to decline. They said consent for HIV testing should be included with general consent for care. There's no need for a separate signed and formed consent. And they said prevention counseling in conjunction with HIV screening is not required. So this has come to be encapsulated under the term of streamlined testing. And so that streamlined counseling, so that instead of the long list of items that people should be counseled about, it's now a very short list of items. And they said there's actually some evidence that giving people prevention counseling at the time of testing really doesn't do much to change their sexual activity anyway. So they said if it's a question between testing more people and giving them a little less counseling, or testing fewer people and giving them a lot more counseling, they would rather test more people. This and this are the two items that the Ontario government has a lot of problems with. So in Ontario, we have not adopted these recommendations. I want to make that very clear. So I'm not endorsing routine tests. I can't. I'm not an agent of the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, but the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care does not agree with these guidelines. At least they've not endorsed them. And this was intended for all healthcare settings. So inpatient settings, emergency departments, urgent care clinics, STD clinics, TB clinics, et cetera, primary care settings. Okay? And why? Because, again, a lot of people, particularly younger people, don't have a regular family doctor. So the idea was that HIV testing would be offered at any encounter with the healthcare system. And the test results should be communicated the same as any other screening test. And clinical care should be by reliable, qualified providers. Well, what about in a place where the prevalence is thought to be low? Well, there the CDC said still start screening and see what happens. And if the yield is less than 1 in 1,000, then you can stop. But everybody should start. So our paper and these guidelines generated a fair bit of attention. And the National Post said this: there are real privacy concerns for routinely testing without explicit consent. No justification for these added risks and costs. So I guess they didn't read our paper because we actually addressed the cost issue. But and they said, why waste time and money testing a healthy, sexually inactive grandma who's never had a blood transfusion in her life? she's a grandmother, she must have had sex in her life, but she's never had a blood transfusion in her life. Phil Berger, who's a friend and colleague of mine, said testing will become so routine, there will be gaps in fully informing patients on the implications, including reporting. Joanne Sessi from the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network said, I hope that we're far from routine HIV testing in Canada. I think there's a very fine line here between a good informed recommendation for testing and coercion. So, to summarize, what are the arguments for and against routine screening? There's the individual benefit, right, identifying people earlier can lead to better health. There are the public health benefits. There's this idea that if we make testing part of routine care, we will destigmatize getting an HIV test itself. So people might perceive it, even being asked to have an HIV test, as something objectionable. But if everybody's doing it, it becomes less objectionable. Against, there are privacy concerns, and I should say I think these are very real concerns for and against, and I'm not advocating necessarily one way or the other. I do have an opinion, and I don't want to diminish anybody's concerns. There are concerns about consent and the ethics of routine screening, whether there truly is sufficient, whether people who agree to it will be sufficiently informed. There are still issues of stigma and discrimination. So even though we are trying to destigmatize it, we may in fact be exposing people to stigma and discrimination. And then there's the issue of cost. And cost is what we've mostly focused on. And I put this slide up in part to say that, when I present what I'm going to present, I'm really just focusing on this, but there's all of these other aspects that have to be considered. So what do we know about HIV and people over the age of 55? Well, we know that the prevalence is less than in younger people. There's some concern that treatment may be less cost effective. So why? Because this is using the cold, hard language of economics. Right? The longer we can keep people alive, the more benefit we get. So simply by being older, people have less opportunity to extend their life, so there might be less benefit. Don't treat me, I'm just the messenger. If older patients have fewer sex partners, there may be less opportunity to prevent transmission. So we said one of the big benefits was that we could prevent transmission, but we do know epidemiologically that older people tend to have fewer sex partners than younger people. So maybe that isn't such a significant concern. The efficacy of HIV treatment in older persons is still uncertain. I'll come back to this in a bit. But there's a little bit of evidence. There's actually evidence both ways. Some studies suggest it might be actually more effective, some say less effective in older people. And the toxicity is also uncertain. And there's even less evidence about this, but some concerns that the toxicity may be higher from the treatments in older people. In the US, approximately 19% of adults with AIDS were 50 or older when they were diagnosed. Okay. So about 1 in 5. In Canada, the last study we have is in 2006, and so, we know that about 14% of new HIV positive cases were over the age of 50 when they were tested. So, so a substantial number of people are over 50. Now, most of these people are probably gay men in Canada. So we can't necessarily infer from this what the prevalence of HIV amongst the general population over the age of 50 is. But it gives us some sense that people over the age of 50 still have some prevalence of HIV that might be considerable. We know from other studies that people who are over the age of 50 are are more likely to have unprotected intercourse. They're less likely to use condoms than younger people. So in fact, all of those messages about safer sex that were targeted at college kids were probably somewhat effective, but they haven't necessarily made it to their parents. There was a WHO study that said HIV was often undiagnosed in the elderly. the new treatments for erectile dysfunction that have been around now for about 10 years or so are often put forward as a possible explanation for increased sexual activity. And anecdotally, we've certainly seen people in our clinic who are older start having sex again after not having it for a while with the aids of some of the newer pharmacological treatments and have become HIV. And there's this perception that healthcare providers are less likely to ask about sex amongst people over the age of 55. And I should put here as well, perception that they're less likely to ask about sexual orientation as well. So, in a study published in 2007, that was a probability sample of U.S. adults. 73% of people between 57 and 64 had had sex at least once in the last year. 53% of people between 65 and 74, and 26% of people between the ages of 75 to 85. So most people looked at these numbers, most of the attention that was paid around these said that these were higher than most people had assumed. And in the U.S. National AIDS Behavioral Survey, 10% of people over 50 had one or more HIV risk factors, and condom use, even amongst that 10%, was rare. So, I said we were going to focus on costs, and the question I'm really going to ask is it cost effective? And what that really means is three things. Asking what are the costs, what are the health effects, and then looking at the ratio of costs to health effects and seeing is that ratio favorable. Why do we do cost effectiveness studies? Well, resources are scarce. There's always a limited amount of money to spend to do all the things that we as a society want to do. So we need to be careful about where we put that money. So cost effectiveness analysis is a formal method of comparing cost to outcomes. It really asks how much money must be spent to obtain a certain improvement in health. It's a measure of efficiency. And this is I said earlier on that I was going to do a little bit of immunology, telling you about CD4 cells. This is the tiniest bit of algebra, and there's no more algebra. So this is a fairly easy equation, right? So if we have two interventions, B and A, the cost effectiveness ratio, the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, is the difference in costs divided by the difference in effects. So we need to know the cost with routine screening and the cost without, the health effects with routine screening and the health effects without, and we divide the difference in costs by the difference in effects. Well, costs we measure in dollars, that's pretty straightforward. How do we measure health effects? Well, we could measure the number of HIV cases averted, which would be useful, but it's difficult to compare screening in HIV then to other interventions. Is it better to put that money into HIV screening or cholesterol testing? Without a similar measure of effect, we can't directly compare health interventions. We could look at life years saved, but this neglects quality of life effects. So usually what we look at in economic analyses in health are something called quality adjusted life years saved, which looks at survival and it adjusts survival for quality of life. So it's recommended by all of the major health technology assessment organizations in the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, most of Europe, but it still remains somewhat controversial. And the idea is this: if we look at how long time on this x-axis and quality of life on the y-axis, and we say that in this time period, the person is in full quality of life, then they have a drop in their quality of life, they go back having full, a little bit of drop, and then the drop. The area under this curve, this whole shaded area, becomes a measure of their quality adjusted life years. So it really combines information about the duration and quality of life. And what's a good ratio? Well, again, very controversial. If it saves money, it improves life, that's a no-brainer. It's easy. That's a good thing to do. Right? But very few things actually save money. So usually we're talking about spending some money and gaining some health, which is okay. We're willing to spend money to gain health. The question is, is it a good investment? Right? So if we have to spend $20,000 or less, most people would consider that to be a good value. If we have to spend more than $100,000, some people now put this up to $200,000, then it's expensive relative to its gains, and it may not be a good investment. So somewhere between here, there's a threshold. The most commonly cited threshold between 20 and 100, you'll see in the literature, is 50,000. And there have been oodles of papers about whether that's a good threshold or not. So some people suggest that we should have a threshold as high as 75 or even 100,000. But in general, somewhere in this 50, 75 range is where most people think the threshold lies. So we ran our analysis, and we specifically were interested in screening in older adults. So our question was, is routine voluntary screening, again, not mandatory, routine voluntary screening of individuals aged 55 to 75 for HIV cost effective? So we built a computer model. So this is not, we didn't go out and actually screen people. We simulated what would happen if we were to screen people using a fancy computer model. Okay? And we took the perspective of the entire society. So it wasn't just the healthcare system or an insurance company. We looked at all the costs and all the health benefits that were accrued across society. Target people were people with unknown HIV status. And what I'm going to show you really is a US analysis. And I'll talk a little bit at the end about whether we can extrapolate this to Canada or not. So essentially the computer model looks at two different strategies: no screening or one-time screening. And then it divides living with HIV into different health states. Not being infected, being asymptomatic, being symptomatic, having treatment, higher stands for highly active antiretroviral therapy, having AIDS, with or without treatment, and then death. So we define these health states. We come up with numbers to say how frequently people would transition between these states. We come up with a cost for each state. We come up with a quality of life for each state. And then we come up with a cost effectiveness ratio. So here are some assumptions. 80% of positive people enter care. We said treatment would start when the CD4 count was 350. We assumed the treatment would continue lifelong. We assumed that if people weren't tested, they would eventually be found to be HIV positive. They'd be found when they develop symptoms. We assumed counseling was associated with a reduction in transmission risk, as I said before, about a 20% reduction. And we assumed that if we get the viral load down, it would also decrease the risk of transmission. We incorporated quality of life effects. We looked at the cost of testing, counseling, and follow-up treatment. So we put all of these into the model. And as I said, these are in US dollars. And then there are some specific features for people over the age of 55. Is that some studies suggest that treatment might actually be more effective in people who are older. Why? Well, older people might have better adherence. They may be better at taking their medications than younger people. And adherence is a significant issue in HIV therapy. Or maybe there are different pharmacodynamics. Maybe the blood levels of the drugs tend to be higher in older people because their metabolism or their physiology is different. But there are also some studies that suggest, and again, not every study has done so, that there may be a longer time to reconstituting the CD4 count. So remember I said CD4 count declines with the disease and then builds back up as reconstituted with treatment. In older people, it might take longer to reconstitute those CD4 count. And then there are some studies that say that age might be an independent risk factor for dying or developing AIDS. So if you took two people, one older and one younger, who were absolutely identical in every other way, including their treatment and how well they took the treatment and the CD4 count, the older person statistically might still do worse than the younger person. Again, all of these things, there's only suggestions in the literature. It's not firm evidence. And there's even less evidence about this, that the drugs may be more toxic. So because we're really unsure about this, in our base case we assumed that there were none of these effects. And then we reran the model, assuming that these effects were in fact there. And so I'll show you what happened. So here are some results. So the first thing we did is looked at the effect on life expectancy. And so here's age, the age at which people are screened and identified under routine screening. And here is the increase in life expectancy with screening. So in other words, remember, people are still identified if they're HIV positive, but they're identified later when they develop symptoms. But somebody who's 55 years old would gain about 0.85, so slightly less than a year of life by being tested early rather than by being tested later. When we adjust that for quality of life, it comes out to about 0.6 because a lot of that time is spent not in full health. And as we go to this side of the graph, people gain much less. So a 75-year-old would gain just about a third of a year of life, or about a quarter of a quality adjusted life year. So that's just the life expectancy gain. Well, what about the cost effectiveness? So here again on this graph, on the x-axis we have age. On the y-axis now we have that incremental cost effectiveness ratio. Remember those numbers we talked about? 20,000 or less, good. 100,000 or more is expensive. Somewhere between is maybe the threshold where things go from being not good value for money to being good value for money. So we showed two thresholds here. A threshold at 50 and a threshold at 100. And we said, okay, well, what if we did HIV screening for people over the age of 55 who had a sex partner? So not the National Post grandma, right? But it's the Toronto Sun grandma who was still sexually active, right? And so if the prevalence of HIV infection in that population is 1%, then no matter what age, it's still cost effective at either threshold. Okay, so being below the threshold is good, being above the threshold is bad. If the prevalence is 0.5%, in other words, 1 in 200 people, then it's actually still cost effective at either threshold up to age 75. If the prevalence is 0.1%, so 1 in 1,000, then it's not cost effective at $50,000. It may be cost effective at $100,000 for people under the age of about 70, but over that it becomes not cost effective. And so this is important because we said that we are probably in Toronto in a setting where we have fairly low prevalence of HIV amongst people over the age of 55. So we are probably somewhere near this line, if not even a little bit above this line. And so the cutoff where it becomes economically attractive might actually be fairly close. So that was people without a sex partner. Essentially, that was people with a sex partner. And what about those people who don't have a sex partner, the National Post grandma? So again, here are thresholds. Here's age, and here's the cost effectiveness ratio. And the solid lines that are 1% prevalent. So if HIV is common, 1 in 100 people have HIV but don't know it, then it still makes economic sense to screen for HIV. At a 0.5% prevalence, it's pretty close to this line. It starts to come up somewhere around the age of 70. And then at 0.1% prevalence, it's above 100,000, as you might expect from the last graph. And it goes a lot higher as we get older. So, the story so far, in people who have a sex partner, at prevalences of 0.5% or less, with or without a sex partner, it's close to the 50,000 threshold. Above, at 0.1% prevalence, probably doesn't make economic sense. Now, those were results that looked at traditional counseling. Remember, we talked about the long checklist of items. And one of the things that the CDC recommended was streamlined counseling. And counseling itself isn't that expensive. But if we're talking about routine testing, and in other words, delivering counseling to every single person who gets testing, gets screened, now we're talking about something that's not very expensive multiplied by a whole lot of people, which becomes very expensive. So if we can decrease the cost of counseling, maybe we could impact the cost effectiveness of screening, which is what we looked at here. And why is it cheaper? Well, it requires less time, first of all, but also one of the things is that people might delegate this responsibility. Physicians might not do this counseling, they might delegate it to other people who are not paid as well as physicians and can do it for cheaper. So, again, age on this axis, cost effectiveness here, and you can see here now, as we expected from before, at 1% or 0.5% prevalence, the numbers are below 50,000, but now they're considerably below 50,000. They're about 20,000, and age here doesn't make as much difference anymore. And even now, 0.1% prevalence for people with a sex partner, if we have streamlined counseling, at the 50,000 threshold, it makes sense up to about age 70. $100,000 threshold, it makes sense for everybody. And then what about without a sex partner and with streamlined counseling? So again, these numbers are higher than before, but still less than 50,000. And at the low prevalence, crosses the 100,000 threshold just at about age 75, but always above the 50,000. So, so there are two things really that, or three things that drive this. Whether streamlined counseling is considered acceptable or not. Right? And again, I said there's a whole bunch of issues around privacy and informed consent and ethics, and those aren't in this formula. Right? So this is really just looking at calculations. So that's one. The second is whether people have a sex partner or not. And then the third is what the threshold is. And different decision makers might have different thresholds. And then we said, well, that's one-time screening. Let's look at whether it makes sense to screen people more than once. Should we screen every 5 years, every 3 years, every year? And the answer there is that those numbers very quickly go up. No matter what the different incidences. But see, even at 5 years, these numbers tend to be around $100,000 per week. So most likely we'd be looking at a one-time screen. So everybody over the age of 55 should have at least one test for HIV if they're sexually active, and maybe even if they're sexually inactive, if we have streamlined counseling. So remember we said there are all these possible age effects. Well, what if we, in our baseline model, we hadn't included those effects? What if we do include them? Well, so we said treatment was less effective, it's more toxic, and age is a risk factor for dying. So with traditional counseling, we said the cost per quality was less than 65,000 if the prevalence was greater than 0.5%. In streamlined counseling, it's less than 70,000 if the prevalence is greater than 0.1%. So it makes a little bit of a difference, but not an awful lot. So as I said, these are really U.S. data. We need good Ontario data. We don't have a good estimate for anywhere in Ontario, for Toronto, Ottawa, Hamilton, the big cities, let alone for smaller Ontario, about what the prevalence of undiagnosed HIV infection is. So I got a message from somebody in Peterborough when this first came out saying, really, you think I should be testing everybody in Peterborough for HIV? And the answer is I can't say it, because we don't have a good estimate of the prevalence of undiagnosed HIV infection anywhere, let alone amongst people over the age of 55. I think we need that data. And there are ways there are studies we could do, public health studies we could do to get that data, but we don't have it. What I've shown you has used U.S. costs, not Ontario costs. I don't think this would make a huge difference. I think costs are actually fairly comparable in terms of healthcare delivery costs. And we need estimates of the uptake, how many people would be willing to consider testing, how many people would actually agree to testing once it was offered. Again, no big reason to suspect that these might be different than where it's been studied in the U.S., but we don't know. And we are a different society, different social values and cultures and cultural mores, so maybe it would be different. Again, we need to think about that. So going back to this slide again, and just to reiterate the point I made before, which I do want to emphasize, I've really only looked at this, and I purposely titled my talk an economic analysis because this is where I can offer some expertise. But these are huge issues that also have to be considered. And decisions shouldn't be made solely on the basis of cost. All of these are important inputs into decision making as well, but we should be having this dialogue because there are these problems both for individuals and at the public health level of undiagnosed HIV. It is a problem, and it's not being adequately addressed. So where would you vote? I mean, we don't have a big audience to vote, but if you were advising the Minister of Health, what would you tell her? Do you think we should continue doing what we're doing? There's no problem. Do you think it should be a public health campaign that targets the high-risk population? Do you think HIV and see your doctor to get tested? Should we incorporate screening to a routine health exam like we do with blood pressure, cholesterol? So you go and your doctor would say, I'm going to check your pressure, your cholesterol, I'm going to do your HIV test. Or should we have mandatory regular HIV screening? So I won't take a poll, but I will tell you that in Ontario, this is what the Ministry of Health did. You might have seen a campaign last year to try and target people, to try and get people to think about HIV and get tested. And that campaign really was targeted, in neighborhoods where there's a large proportion of gay men or injection drug users. So we're really still trying to do this targeted screening for high-risk populations. We're not quite at, we're nowhere near really this idea of routine screening. And I'm not saying that we should be, right? I think we need the data first, really the data about the prevalence of undiagnosed HIV in order to make an informed decision and start that conversation. And that applies to everybody, but especially to people over the age of 55, where we still don't know what's going on. But we certainly, I think, if I have to close on this, what we do need to think about is that sexuality and aging, speaking to the converted, that sexuality and aging is often neglected, but comes with certain risks, including HIV, and we shouldn't forget it.
Are there questions from online? While she's checking that, I was going to make an observation about there being a lot of single older people. Look at the targeted dating kinds of programs that are out there. So maybe in the decades to come, it might be a bigger issue, or at least in the boomer decades that we're in now, where the boomers are older, maybe that is a bigger issue because there are a lot of single older 55 people.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And this again with the drugs for erectile dysfunction in men.
Yes.
And there are new drug companies are very actively looking at drugs to increase libido in both men and women. The pharmaceutical industry certainly has recognized that there's a lot of money to be made.
There's a big market.
Looking at sexuality amongst older people. and there are a lot of single people, and so I think it is just going to become an increasing issue. I agree.
Doesn't look like there's any questions. But I do have a general question. I was wondering, you mentioned twice that HIV, like it's most prevalent, I think you said among gay males. Is that, like, I always thought that it was just a myth that it was more prevalent among gay males, but it was actually as prevalent among heterosexuals as...
Well, it depends where. So it's very regional, actually. So in Toronto, it's the prevalence amongst gay males is considerably higher than it is amongst straight males or amongst women. In some parts of New York, it's equally prevalent amongst gay and straight males. In many parts of the world, it's much more prevalent amongst heterosexuals than homosexuals. Vancouver has infection rates amongst injection drug users that are as high as many of the worst areas in the world. Toronto, the rate amongst injection drug users is actually quite low. So it's very difficult to make general statements like that. It really depends on where people are. There was a very interesting article just in last week's New England Journal of Medicine looking at HIV infection rates in different subpopulations of the United States, comparing them to internationally, showing that if you go into the Bronx, Washington D.C., there are infection rates in some of those neighborhoods that are as bad as many countries in Africa that we think of as being very hard hit by HIV.
And also, how come there's not a lot of Canadian data? Is it because people rely mostly on the U.S. data, or is there like a specific reason why?
Well, so yes, and part of it's a funding thing because these are expensive studies. If you think about it, we have to test a whole lot of people to find a few people that are HIV positive. So it is a fairly expensive study to run, and we've historically not invested so much in health care research as the United States has. But there's also, it's just, the United States in a sense is the exception here. So in other words, all of Europe and Australia, all the other sort of Western economies and Western countries are like Canada. You still do targeted screening and don't have a lot of research on what the prevalence rates are. So it's the U.S. that really has sort of, I think, been a leader in sort of thinking, recognizing that there is this problem and then targeting research funds that way. So, I think we should give them credit for that. In some senses, we've been, still in that thinking, still in that paradigm of where we were when HIVF, and we started that there's some risk groups, and we need to identify those risk groups. And our prevalence rates are not as high as they are in many American cities. So that might be a very appropriate paradigm, right? But thinking is changing, particularly as treatment evolves. How do we think about testing for HIV? So what I'm really trying to say is, don't get stuck in a rut. Let's let our thinking evolve and see. That's a good question.
Thank you very
Thank
much,
you.
Doctor.
It was great. It was really interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. People will be happy that there's a podcast and they can see it later.